Welcome to the world today on Channels Television. I am Amarachi Ubani, and we're looking at the top stories here in Africa. One of them is a Kenyan toddler who's been discharged from hospital after recovering from surgery to remove a bullet lodged in his brain during a church shooting. The father, however, says the family is scared to return home at the moment. The 18-month-old Satrin Osinya was wounded when unknown gunmen opened fire on a church near the coastal city of Mombasa on March the 23rd. Six people died in the attack, including Satrin's mother, who was buried last week. Doctors believe the bullet, which killed her while she was shielding her son, exited her body and buried itself in his head during the shooting. The bullet was removed about a week later during a 3-hour operation at the Kenyatta National Hospital in the capital, Nairobi. Well, we're in South Sudan now, where the United Nations has denied reports that it is showing shocking indifference towards some 21,000 people sheltering at one of its compounds in the capital, Juba. And on Wednesday, Médecins Sans Frontières said the group was living in flood water contaminated with fecal matter. But an official says the UN is doing its best to improve conditions. The group sought refuge at the compound after fighting broke out between government and rebels in December. The UN has around 8,000 peacekeepers on ground in South Sudan, which is the world's newest state. It estimates that more than 1 million people have fled their homes since the conflict began, while nearly a third of South Sudan's population, that's about 3.7 million people, are at severe risk of starvation. Turning our attention now to Ebola virus raging through West Africa. At least 7 patients infected with the virus in Guinea have recovered and allowed to go home. Médecins Sans Frontières says though the virus has a high mortality rate, a number of patients have managed to fight it off. There's no cure or vaccine for Ebola, the world's deadliest viruses, but people have a better chance of surviving if it is identified early and they get supportive medical care. So far, this outbreak has killed more than 2/3 of those who have been infected, including 101 people in Guinea and 10 in neighboring Liberia. Ebola can kill up to 90% of those infected if it is passed on through contact with fluids of infected people or animals, such as urine, sweat and blood. In order to prevent contacting the virus, one should avoid traveling to areas of known outbreaks, in this case will be Guinea and Liberia, and also wash your hands frequently. Also avoid bushmeat and avoid contact with infected people. Finally, don't handle the corpses of those who died of Ebola virus, especially organized and trained teams should bury the remains using appropriate safety equipment. Well, over in the Central African Republic, at least 30 people have been killed, another 10 wounded as fighting broke out between rival sectarian militias and in the capital. Police say that most of those who died in the central town of Ikoa were civilians hit by stray bullets. The predominantly Christian anti-Balaka militia attacked positions held by mainly Muslim Seleka rebels. Cars exploded. The Central African Republic exploded into violence early in December last year amid mounting resentment towards a Muslim-led government. Muslim rebels seized power in March by 2013 by overthrowing President Francois Bozize, who had been in power for a decade.
African forces that now are available that participate in these intervention and those type of things have expanded incredibly in the last 20 years. I mean, 6 nations in Somalia, 9, going to 16 in Mali, are all African, partners in their forces. So, thank you. The best example to show the linkages is the Alaminas attack, where really 3 of those groups got together, trained, and they took the best people and executed that attack. So that's the type of collaboration they're doing. They're also transferring things that are very worrisome, like the IED technology and tactics, techniques, and procedures. As you know, a significant number through
Well, joining us now via Skype is VOA's Jeff Selden. He joins us now from the U.S. Pentagon. Jeff, thanks for staying with us on The World Today. I do believe Jeff should be coming up in a few seconds. But in the meantime, anyway, let's begin with how close the violence or the crisis in the Central African Republic is close enough to being called a genocide. I don't believe that Jeff heard me. Well, Jeff, if you can hear me, how close is the violence and the crisis in the Central African Republic close enough to being called a genocide?
I can hear you now. At least according to the U.S. Africa Command, they feel that while they are very concerned about the situation, the violence, the killing, the displaced people, they feel that unlike in Rwanda 20 years ago, where there was killing on such a mass scale, the continent, the landscape of Africa has changed considerably since then, especially with the ability of African forces to come in and help take care of the situation, help intervene, and prevent some of the violence. As you heard, the AFRICOM commander, General David Rodriguez, spoke about how just now there are 6 nations who are helping out in Somalia with peacekeeping efforts, 9 currently in Mali, about to be 16. The African forces, he says, are much better positioned to do this. And in addition, in contrast to years ago, the United States is also in a better position to offer help. They have AFRICOM, which has been in existence now for several years. In addition, there are more forces on the ground, U.S. forces on the ground. It's still a small footprint, but better positioned. There's a forward operating base in Djibouti, and there are multiple efforts where U.S. forces are going in, working with African governments and African forces on a range of issues so that in situations like these, in crises, that everyone together can come together and intervene and try to prevent a situation from getting much worse than it already is.
You know, Jeff, when you say a genocide for the Central African Republic, it almost sounds like Rwanda 20 years ago. Are there any links to what happened then replaying in the Central African Republic?
You have, of course, the ethnic tensions that are boiling over. What the U.S. says is much different, though, is the ability of so many countries in the area to respond and to do what they can. They say nobody has the ability, nobody has the resources to do everything themselves. But now there's an ability to work together, to cooperate, bring forces in, bring aid in more quickly, deploy much more quickly to hotspots and respond to them, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. The U.S. really feels that in that way, the landscape of Africa, the military political landscape of Africa has changed. And they note that even countries that maybe 10 years ago were struggling and having their own internal conflicts are now able to, in many cases, contribute peacekeepers to these efforts. And they see that as a key difference.
So, Jeff, the troops on ground, 8,000 U.S. soldiers, 8,000 peacekeepers on ground in the Central African Republic, who exactly are they fighting against? Are they fighting against the anti-Seleka group, or are they fighting against the Muslim group who wants to take over power?
Well, the U.S. has about 5,000 to 6,000 troops altogether in AFRICOM stationed in Africa. Some of those are at the headquarters, which are actually in Stuttgart, Germany. And there are others, a few thousand at a forward operating base in Djibouti. So the U.S. doesn't have a heavy military footprint or tons of peacekeepers in Africa. What they are doing, though, is what those troops and those forces are doing are working with African countries, African allies, to train them in what to do, how to respond to these emergencies. And so that's where the U.S. is trying to make the biggest difference. Another place where the U.S. is increasing its presence is in Uganda in the effort to help the African Union Regional Task Force track down and capture warlord Joseph Kony and the LRA, where the U.S. has recently announced they already had about 100 Special Forces trainers in there helping the task force. Now they're sending about 150 more personnel along with about 4 planes to help in that effort. And they feel there it is making a difference that Kony's forces have become diminished over time And General Rodriguez, during a briefing earlier this week, expressed confidence that as the U.S. continues to help the African Union forces, that eventually they will find Kony, they will catch him, and put an end to that violence.
Well, thanks a lot, Jeff, for your insights on what's going on in the Central African Republic, as well as what U.S. Troops and African Union troops are doing on the ground. Thanks a lot. Jeff Selden is a VOA correspondent in the Pentagon.